what it's worth, I am the senior person at UW Green Bay. I am 64. Walker has driven out my older colleagues for fear they would lose their health care and retirement benefits. I miss a lot of people, even though I have a certain advantage now in having no one who is older than I am. I can be the sage at the university. I want to thank Garrett Cohen for contacting me and inviting me. I want to thank Francia Bernard, who is my buddy. If I ever feel lonely, I know I can turn to her, and I want to thank her for this glass of wine. And it is a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to tell you something that happened on the way up here today. 2 weeks ago, I was supposed to be on Face the Nation, which would have been a phenomenal experience. And I got bumped for the Veterans Administration scandal. And they said that I would be on for D-Day weekend. We were driving up, my wife and I, my wife Lorna, and she was bringing me up to date on the Bergdahl scandal. And a thought crossed my mind. And then an email came in. I was bumped from Face the Nation this weekend. Maybe July 4th, third time lucky, I don't know. But I can tell you this. Thank goodness I was so looking forward to this occasion tonight. This means a great deal to me. First of all, to be back here in Door County with all of you, and in some ways to boost the campaigns of our candidates, but also because I need the company, given the disappointment that I had an hour, well now it's 3 hours ago. So thank you for having me tonight. Oddly enough, I became known as the Thomas Paine guy, and this is the Thomas Paine dinner. And you would say, well, why aren't you talking to us about Thomas Paine again? I have the new book out, but this is something I want to point out. Thomas Paine was ignored by Americans for many, many years. The last president of the Revolutionary era, the nation's founding era, who not only quoted Thomas Paine, but used his name and embraced him, was Thomas Jefferson. The very next president to quote Thomas Paine and to actually use his name when doing so was Franklin Roosevelt. That's first. The second thing I want to point out is that Thomas Paine was born on January 29th. Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th. But most important is this, and this is something that I learned in my research, and that is that in spite of the fact that Paine came from a working class background and made a revolution, turned the American colonial rebellion into a revolution, despite his story being so different than the story of Franklin Roosevelt, who was the son of Hudson River gentry, the closest thing we had to an aristocracy. They had something in common. They both put into words our finest aspirations. So oddly enough, I don't see much of a difference between Paine and Roosevelt. They were, in their ways, kindred spirits. Kindred spirits. So let me begin, okay? Let me say one further thing, however, before I go too far, and that is, I wrote The Fight for the Four Freedoms, which, by the way, you have to buy. The Democratic Party of Door County is selling the books, not me. Okay? No, this is true. Okay? You already bought the books, I hope. The trick is, will you buy the books and support your party? Okay.
Thank you.
What I was going to say is that I wrote The Fight for the Four Freedoms not simply as a historian. I wrote it as a historical and a political advocate. I think that, look, there are those who say we make too much of the greatest generation, of the young men and women of the 30s and 40s. We bought the books, we went to the movies, we built the monuments, give us a break, there are those who say. I think we make too little of them. I think we make too little of them because what we make of them leaves out the most important part of their story. And I'll repeat this in my talk. They were the most progressive generation in American history. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, they made America over. They made, as Thomas Paine said, we have it in our power to make the world over again. That's what that generation did. From Social Security to Medicare and Medicaid. From the CCC to the EPA. From the National Labor Relations Act to the organizing of public employees. And look at what the Republicans went after first. Freedom of speech. My collective bargaining rights. Okay? That was the most progressive generation in American history. Will we redeem that generation's labors? That's the question. So I don't think we make too much. I think we don't make enough of them. I think that every time we speak, we need to speak of them and of what we must do to live up to their example. We need to remember. We need to remember what conservatives have never wanted us to remember and what liberals have all too often forgotten. We need to remember what we have been trying so, I want to use the F word, I'm avoiding it because I know I'm being taped. We need to remember what we have been trying so damn hard to remember. Now especially, after more than 30 years of subordinating the public good to corporate priorities and private greed, of subjecting ourselves to widening inequalities and intensifying insecurities, of allowing our rights to be threatened and here in Wisconsin taken away, and of denying our own democratic impulses and yearnings. We need to remember who we are. We need to remember that we are the children and grandchildren of the men and women who both rescued the United States from economic destruction in the Great Depression and defended it against fascism in the Second World War. We need to remember that we are the children and grandchildren of the men and women who not only saved the nation from economic ruin and political oblivion, but also turned it into the strongest and most prosperous country on earth. And most of all, we need to remember, listen carefully, that's my professorial voice, by the way. We need to remember that we are the children and grandchildren of the men and women who accomplished all of that in the face of fierce, conservative, reactionary, and corporate opposition. And despite their own faults and failings, by harnessing the powers of democratic government and making America freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before. Now, when all that they fought for is under siege, and we too find ourselves confronting crises and forces that threaten the nation and all that it stands for, we need to remember that we are the children and grandchildren of the most progressive generation in American history. We are the children of the men and women who articulated, fought for, and endowed us with the promise of the four freedoms. On the afternoon of January 6, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt went up to Capitol Hill to deliver the annual message to Congress. Just weeks earlier, he had defeated Republican Wendell Willkie. We would be lucky, by the way, to have a Wendell Willkie leading the Republican Party today. Defeated him at the polls and won re-election to an unprecedented third term. But Roosevelt now faced a far bigger challenge, one even more daunting than those he confronted in his first and second terms. Still stalked by the Great Depression, the United States was now threatened by the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. And with war already raging east and west, Americans had yet to agree upon what the hell they were going to do. The president, however, did not falter. He not only proceeded to propose measures to address the emergency, he also gave dramatic new meaning to all men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We, the people of the United States, a new birth of freedom, and my favorite, government of the people, by the people, for the people. Roosevelt knew about crises, but he knew as well what Americans could accomplish even in the darkest of times. Born in 1882, FDR had grown up privileged, the son of Hudson River gentry. Yet long before becoming president, he had suffered serious defeats and setbacks. None more devastating than contracting polio in 1921 at the age of 39. The disease had left him permanently unable to stand up or walk without assistance. But supported by his wife Eleanor and other family members and friends, he had risen above the paralysis to become the most dynamic political figure in the United States. Moreover, his experiences in the course of doing so had reaffirmed and deepened his already powerful faith and confidence in God, in himself, and in his fellow citizens. All of which had enabled him, in the face of the worst economic and social catastrophes in the nation's history, and in response to a series of popular movements by veterans, by workers, and by farmers, to say, now listen to this, this is something we rarely remember, but in 1930 he said, "There is no question in my mind that it is time for the country to become fairly radical for a generation." To declare not too many months after that, some months after that, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. To later insist that democracy is not a static thing, it is an everlasting march. And to proudly proclaim in 1936 that this generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. Propelled by the popular energies that his words and his actions inspired, Roosevelt determinedly pursued the initiatives of relief, recovery, reconstruction, and reform known as the New Deal. Together, president and people, not always in unison, severely tested each other, made real mistakes and regrettable compromises, and suffered serious defeats and disappointments. Nevertheless, challenging and pushing each other to live up to their finest ideals and aspirations, FDR and his fellow citizens advanced them further than either had expected or ever imagined possible. Even as they confronted and dealt with harsh and concerted attacks from the powerful conservative and corporate antagonists they faced, they not only rejected the sirens of authoritarianism, they redeemed the nation's historic promise by initiating, and I mean this, revolutionary changes in government and public life, and radically extending freedom, equality, and democracy in America. By way of a great host of alphabet soup agencies and associations. If any of you need me to define these afterward, don't hesitate to ask. From the SEC, the CCC, and the WPA, to the CIO, the AYC, and the NAACP. In case you don't know, the AYC is the American Youth Congress. They subjected big business and public, this is Roosevelt and his fellow citizens, subjected big business and banking to public account and regulation. They empowered the federal government to address the needs of working people and the poor, and they established a social security system. They organized labor unions, consumer campaigns, and civil rights organizations. They fought for their rights and broadened the we in We the People. They built schools, libraries, parks, and playgrounds. Along the lakeshore, Kiwani, go into the post office, Treasury Department, okay? Look at the mural. It's America embodied, okay? That wasn't in my talk. Sorry. They built schools, libraries, parks, and playgrounds. They expanded the nation's public infrastructure. They improved the American environment. They cultivated the arts and refashioned popular culture. If nothing else, think of swing music. And though there was still much to be done, they imbued themselves with fresh democratic hopes and aspirations and enabled themselves to fight the enemy that was coming for them. Standing before the American people and their assembled representatives that early January day in 1941, Roosevelt surely believed their rendezvous with destiny had arrived. Speaking without hesitation, he proceeded both to expound upon the profound crisis and mortal dangers facing the United States, and to explain how the nation could not just confront them, but actually prevail in doing so. Rejecting isolationist arguments that Americans should simply hunker down behind great defensive walls, he rallied his fellow citizens around a dynamic image of America serving as the great arsenal of democracy. And he dismissed conservatives' claims that the crisis required giving up Americans' hard fought for advances of the past 8 years. Roosevelt argued that an effective mobilization required Americans to not simply sustain their democratic achievements, but actually extend and deepen them. Finally, articulating Americans' grandest ideals and strivings anew, the president defined a cause and a generation. In the future days which we seek to make secure, he said, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. The third is freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear. The vision was international, but Roosevelt rooted it firmly in American experience and American imagination. He said, quote, since the beginning of our American history, we have been engaged in change, in a perpetual, peaceful revolution, a revolution which goes on steadily, quietly, adjusting itself to changing conditions without the concentration camp or the quicklime in the ditch. The world order which we seek is the cooperation of free countries working together in a friendly, civilized society. Isolationists denounced his call to turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy, and conservatives rejected his expansive democratic vision. But most Americans responded otherwise. Most Americans backed the call to action, affirmed the promise pronounced, and in the wake of December 7, 1941, made freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear the nation's war aims. In the name of those 4 freedoms, 16 million Americans of every faith, class, and color, put on uniforms and pursued a global struggle that we would come to call the good war, not for the character of the combat, but for the rightness of the cause and the unity of purpose in which we pursued it. With their allies, they would storm beaches, slog through jungles, tramp across icy fields, sail through submarine-infested waters, fly missions over heavily fortified territories, and punch, push, claw, and ultimately power their way to victory. And contrary, listen to this carefully, and contrary to many a later historian's assertion, America's soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen fought not just for their buddies, but also, as letters, reports, and memoirs attest, for the promise of the 4 freedoms. Yes, racism sorely marked the war effort, a racism that produced a Jim Crow segregated military, a racism that interned Japanese Americans, a racism that instigated deadly urban riots. Nevertheless, in late 1944, Harper magazine editor Frederick Lewis Allen would write that Americans had become not simply a united people, but also one possessed of a faith which, with the aid of bulldozers, was able to move mountains. End of quote. But surely the greatest testament to Americans' faith is that those who most suffered the nation's injustices, America's racial and religious minorities, not only believed in the nation's historic purpose and promise and refused to be defined by that racism, they also went all out as much as their fellow citizens, if not even more so. Determined to secure America's promise against both America's foreign enemies and its own racists and reactionaries. By the way, there's a word you don't hear very much. Reactionaries. I want all of you to start using it, because that's what they are about. They are not radicals, the right, they are reactionaries. Okay? In any case, racial and religious minorities refuse to be defined by the racism of those reactionaries. Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Jewish Americans served in greater numbers proportionally than any other groups. And though African American numbers were limited by official quota, 1 million of them served. Even 22,500 Japanese Americans served, despite the fact that many of their own families were interned in camps. At the same time, Americans at home not only prayed for the safe and sound return of their loved ones, they also went all out as workers and as volunteers to provide the arms and material required for victory, to maintain the morale and the material well-being of GIs and civilians alike, and to protect and improve what those servicemen and women were defending. Once again, President and people were to test each other, make tragic mistakes and sorry compromises, and suffer serious defeats and disappointments. Nonetheless, they not only prevailed over their enemies, they also once again compelled each other to actually enhance American democratic life in the process. Predictably, the right and the conservative rich continued to oppose the enhancement of democracy. Congressional Republicans and Southern Democrats, who are today all Republicans, joined together not only to limit the power of labor, but also, listen to this, to block or weaken bills enabling overseas GIs to vote. The Republicans feared that most GIs would vote for FDR, which, by the way, they did. The Dixiecrats feared that black GIs would get to vote and actually liked doing so, which they did. Concurrently, business executives worried about Americans' democratic impulses, but knowing they could not openly oppose the four freedoms, harnessed the freedoms to corporate ads and promotions, even as they denied the promise of those freedoms and fervently tried to rewrite them to include a fifth freedom, freedom of private enterprise. Of course, the right and conservative rich had good reason to worry. Americans were not only vigorously expanding the labor, consumer, and civil rights movements, I'm leaving out all the numbers, okay? Millions lined up in the labor movement. Millions of women turned out to police prices in the shopping centers. The NAA, I'm telling you the numbers now. The NAACP grew from 50,000 to almost 500,000 in the course of the war. Americans were also subjecting the industry and the marketplace to greater public control, reducing inequality and poverty, and, admittedly, the race riots occurred, further transforming the we and we the people. Moreover, now let's listen to this in particular, okay, as I would tell my students. The overwhelming majority of Americans endorsed the idea of pursuing new progressive initiatives at war's end. Public polls showed that 83% of Americans wanted to expand Social Security to include national health care. If you look at the figures, at least 80% of the 83% were Republicans. 90% of Americans favored joint planning by government, business, and labor to do away with unemployment after the war. 73% I'm dying here. Hold on. Thank you, Franchi. 73% not only supported launching New Deal-style public works projects to provide jobs, they wanted a policy that would say that if you could not find a job, government would make sure you had one. And by the way, and I'm just scratching the surface on these polls. Now, all of this gave FDR the courage. FDR didn't invent this out of thin air. He wasn't high on drugs or alcohol. What he was doing is he was articulating American aspirations. It gave him the courage, those kinds of numbers, to propose not just a GI Bill of Rights, which, by the way, the Southern Democrats were ready to block the GI Bill of Rights for fear that blacks would be included, and they were. The Republicans didn't want to pass it because they were convinced they'd never see the presidency again, knowing that Roosevelt would turn it into a Democratic office. But FDR not only proposed a GI Bill of Rights, he proposed a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, to assure freedom from want and fear for all Americans. As he presented it, the second Bill of Rights would include the right to a job, note, with a living wage. You know, back in the 30s, at the beginning of the New Deal, when Roosevelt signed the first minimum wage executive order, he said, let's face it, no country, I'm quoting, no company should be allowed to exist in this country that does not pay a living wage. You ever heard that from a Democratic president since? You know, we're Democrats, but look, let's face it. Our Democratic leaders need a good kick in the ass, okay? Vote for Mary Burke, but make sure she does not forget labor. Yes. I didn't hear labor in what she had to say. The right of every family to a decent home, the right to health care, the right to security in old age, and the right to a good education. That was in 1944. That's 70 years ago. God, I want to use the F word again. What the hell are we doing? Have you heard our president, our Democratic leaders say that? It was not to happen. For as much as an overwhelming majority of Americans wanted it to happen, the right-wing congressional coalition opposed it. And yet that coalition could not block the enactment of the historic and famous GI Bill. A massive, not liberal, a massive social democratic program that was to enable 12 million veterans to progressively transform themselves and their country for the better. You know, this is D-Day weekend coming up. And I've read all the magazines and all the related stuff, and there isn't a single mention of the four freedoms. There isn't a single mention of what they fought for. You know, my father fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He got a Purple Heart, okay? He was a decorated veteran. And when you pick up my book, you'll see a number of people to whom the book is dedicated, from my friend, I'm going to name drop, Norman Lear, to my dad, who passed away 20 years ago. They deserve to be remembered for what they accomplished, which was not only to win a war, it was also to give us a legacy of social democratic ideals. FDR passed away in April 1945. Germany and Japan surrendered in the months that followed. But the promise of the four freedoms did not expire. Even as the United States began to take off in an unprecedented economic expansion and enter into a Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union, most Americans, now listen to this, most Americans, because you never hear this, bolstered by the public investments of the New Deal and the war effort, and the many benefits of the GI Bill, set out in pursuit of that promise. Look, 12 million veterans took advantage of the GI Bill. You know what the population of the United States was in 1945? Just over 130 million. That means that nearly 1 in 10 Americans benefited from the GI Bill. 1 in 10. Don't forget, 1 of 8 Americans was in uniform. If we can do that in war, why the hell can't we do that in peace? But of course, not all Americans wanted to enhance American democratic life. Conservatives, reactionaries, corporate bosses had their own ambitions for post-war America. Determined as ever, to reverse the progressive accomplishments of the Roosevelt years, cancel out the promise of the 4 freedoms, and bury the very idea of an economic Bill of Rights, they set themselves anew to contain or suppressing, if not actually extinguishing, Americans' democratic aspirations and energies. Harnessing the Cold War, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the ensuing McCarthyism to their causes, they enjoyed successes. By the early 1950s, the right and conservative rich had tamed liberals, marginalized radicals, and stymied the campaigns of labor and the civil rights movement. Not to mention, effectively effaced the 4 freedoms from public debate. And yet, for all of their efforts, they could not get Americans to forget their hard-won victories or the promise that encouraged them. In fact, as Americans continued to make the nation ever stronger and more prosperous, they pressed freedom, equality, and democracy forward. Never as quickly as the majority wanted, but always forward. I remember when that was our motto in Wisconsin. The generation, oh, by the way, as a footnote, since Gaylord Nelson's name came up, do remember him as the father of Earth Day. But if you leave it at that, you are doing an injustice to his memory. He was one of the most progressive U.S. senators in the post-war period. He fought McCarthy before he ever got to the Senate. He was one of the founders in Wisconsin of the American Veterans Committee, a national organization of veterans committed to progressive ideals. 100,000 veterans joined. They insisted on integrated and co-ed organizations, okay? You'll love this, okay? They included as members Franklin Roosevelt's son, Bill Malden, I'll go to the punchline. Ronald Reagan was a member of the most progressive veterans organization after World War II. You know, they should have kept him in Hollywood, right? What can I say? Okay? I also want to point out one of the ironies of history. I shouldn't stop for my speech here, but in 1960, Kennedy versus Nixon, vice presidential candidates Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. and Lyndon Johnson, all 4 World War II veterans. Okay? The only one of the 4, however, who was actually a member of the American Veterans Committee, believe me, a very progressive veterans group, was Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., not Kennedy. Kennedy actually used to tell people, I'm no liberal, I never joined the American Veterans Committee. Sorry, I'm sorry, but let's be honest about history, okay? So, they pushed, right? They pushed. The generation that beat the Great Depression by taking up the labors of the New Deal and then defeated fascism and imperialism by going all out became a decidedly civic generation. They built new communities, new churches, new schools, and new civic associations. They secured higher living standards for themselves and their families. 1 of every 3 American workers was in a labor union before public employees had any collective bargaining rights. And what state first enacted collective bargaining rights for public employees? Wisconsin. Thank you. That generation expanded Social Security under Eisenhower. They even began to enact laws up north banning racial and religious discrimination, not to mention enabled the Supreme Court to decide in favor of desegregation in Brown versus Board. And when that generation was seriously challenged in the 1960s to live up to the promise that so many of them had struggled to articulate in advance, they recommitted the nation to doing so. The power of the four freedoms endured. Those who marched for civil rights, those who campaigned to end poverty, those who organized public employee unions, those who pushed to enact health care for the elderly and poor, those who demanded equal rights for women, those who reformed the nation's immigration law, those who expanded public education and the arts, those who pressed for greater regulation of business and industry to protect the environment, workers, and consumers. Those many who protested the Vietnam War did not regularly recite the four freedoms, but many did. Moreover, they were not only inspired and informed by the struggles and achievements of the president and people who first proclaimed and fought for those freedoms, they were actually called to act anew by men and women of that generation. Labor leaders like A. Philip Randolph, Walter Reuther, Cesar Chavez, Jerry Worth, civil rights activists such as Ella Baker and James Farmer, environmentalists like Rachel Carson and Barry Commoner, and I can lay out for you, if you wish, biographies, and feminists such as Betty Friedan. They were all of that generation. Go look, if you have a chance, at the 1960 Democratic Party platform, written by Chester Bowles, who headed the Office of Price Administration during World War II. It may well have been the most progressive platform of the post-war years. In fact, from the Kennedy and Johnson White Houses to the House and Senate, those who actually proposed and enacted the laws and initiatives that made the decade so progressive, notably including, as I said, Wisconsin's own Gaylord Nelson, were themselves veterans of the democratic struggles of the 30s and 40s. I can't help but note there was a letter recently in the New York Times by a World War II veteran, a writer named Edward Wood Jr. There was a big controversy recently. Should we redeem Lyndon Johnson's memory? Suffers a great deal, obviously, as a consequence of the decision to send 500,000 Americans into Vietnam. Responding to that issue regarding the question of LBJ's legacy, Wood wrote to the Times, quote, "For my generation of World War II veterans, the social legislation passed under Lyndon Baines Johnson's leadership helped fulfill some of the ideals we had fought for in the war, expressed in 1941 by FDR's Four Freedoms. I cried," he said, "from a long-delayed joy when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Johnson's other legislation still resonates 50 years later. His initiatives helped create the society we fought for from 1941 to 45. I'm going to ad-lib this. Let me be clear. The right, the conservatives, the reactionaries, the corporate rich hated Roosevelt and did everything they could to prevent the New Deal. They were prepared to stay out of World War II. Maybe we'd all be speaking German today, okay? After the war, they did everything they could to block the renewal of the New Deal. They over and over again sought to suppress the memory of what that generation was about. Here's the best example. Let me go back to our dear friend Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was in love with Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s. He memorized the perorations, the key lines of Roosevelt's speeches. We know he became an anti-left figure in the 1950s in light of the Cold War and the opportunities of working for big capital. We know that. He then began to preach against the New Deal, against Social Security, against the TVA, against the rights of labor, even as he led a labor union. In the 1960s, He was the key speaker on behalf of the Goldwater campaign. He tempered himself as governor of California because he began to figure out that there was no way he'd advance if he continued to speak as he did. In the 1970s, he continued to speak in the guise of the right, but he tempered what he had to say. He wins office in 1980 as president because most Americans were so fed up with Carter's refusal to act like a Democrat that they stayed home. Reagan's now president. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, he himself was a veteran. Never left Southern California. Hell, he never left the bed at home. I'm not joking. But he was a veteran. And he had good fantasies of what it meant to be a veteran. He goes to Normandy on the 40th anniversary, and he gives what is absolutely one of the most beautiful speeches ever given by a president in honor of a generation, talking about the boys of Pontohc and how they scaled the cliffs at Normandy, and how they must have loved liberty so much that it empowered them to rise above those cliffs. And everyone said, oh my God, this man, he understands America. The thing is that everything Reagan said before and after was about suppressing the memory of that generation. He would occasionally refer to the Four Freedoms because he wanted to rewrite them. On July 3rd, 1987, he appears at the Jefferson Memorial to a huge crowd of Americans at an event sponsored by one of the most conservative organizations in the United States, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he announces his intention to create an economic Bill of Rights. It is literally the upside-down version of everything Roosevelt said. It's basically the right to make a profit, the right to own property, the right to enterprise. That's what he was about. That's what the right was about. They were about suppressing what that generation was about. That was his own generation. He continued in that vein right through the end in his farewell address in January of 1989. He gave a speech on the radio to the American people. Talked about what he felt he'd accomplished. And he then recalled his speech at Normandy and the imperative that we should teach our children American history. Teach them to remember what we are about. He said to us in that farewell address, let us make sure that our children know America is about freedom. And then he said, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise. He wasn't satisfied with the fifth freedom. He literally wanted to wipe out any memory of freedom from want and fear. But you know what? It's easy to get upset about that. It doesn't matter what he said. What it matters is this. He could never have become president if Democrats, liberals, and progressives had not already forgotten FDR and the Four Freedoms and what that generation was about. So let's not take solace in the fact that we're better than they are. We are no better than they are until we redeem the Four Freedoms. Until we remember what Roosevelt said. It is time for us to make America fairly radical for a generation. Thank you.